Welcome to a presentation about how to help intentional communities become better. I have these seemingly stringent criteria for success. They're just mine. You can have anything you want. You can say, as long as we have a good time, we're successful. But I want to do better than that. I want people to be happy. I want these communities to last a long, long time. I want people to want to stay there and not just be stuck there, unhappy. I want it to become a choice for many people on this earth, not just a few wealthy, privileged people. I want it to be an alternative to what is quickly becoming a declining civilization. So maybe we should learn something from the past. In her book, My Name is Chellis Glendinning, and I'm in recovery from Western civilization. The author noticed that our civilization focuses on individuals, everything, economics, psychology, sociology, not everybody, but it is the mainstream way of looking at things. Here are two quotes from her which contrast this viewpoint with the more native tribal viewpoint. The goal of development, according to psychology, is to create boundaries, to encase things, the encapsulated individual. To a nature-based person, individual consciousness does not exist. The unit of wholeness is the universe, soul of the world. Here's another. If a Kung has a problem, it is not their problem. It is a sign of a problem in the community or the cosmos. Now, maybe this is not totally accurate. Maybe tribal people had a sense of nature spirituality, but they may not have seen the cosmos clearly. They may have seen their tribe as the unit of wholeness, and other tribes, if they came in competition with them, may have been threatening. So I think modern science can offer a bridge between this increasingly untenable view that sees the individual as the be-all and end-all, something that is consistent with our global economy, and the tribal view where nature and the tribe were the be-all and end-all. We've noticed, even before modern evolutionary biology and psychology, some people have noticed that human organizations tend to be nested in this fashion, starting with cells, which I don't show because I don't have enough room in this diagram, and organs, then what we call individuals, human beings, then families, tribes or villages or intentional communities, cities, which I don't show here, nations, and then finally the earth, and then maybe the whole universe. These don't exist as individuals necessarily. I'm trying to extend the idea of individuality to some of these lower and some of these higher levels of organization than an individual human being. Some of them emerge, in fact all of them emerge and evolve. And by emergence, I mean, so what do we mean by emergence? We mean that the higher level qualities are not reducible to the lower level qualities. This has also been noticed by folks in the spiral dynamics communities. Graves and Wilbur. So just because an entity is at a higher level doesn't mean that it has emerged individuality yet. For example, a nation or the earth or the cosmos may not have evolved to individuality. If the cosmos is not alive, it may not able to do it. Only living entities undergo this kind of evolution. Well, we don't know if the cosmos is alive or not. An example is relationships, which is not just about two individuals. There's a third entity that emerges, as Stan Tatkin and Harville Hendricks have discovered. But it's true at least all the way to a tribe and village. These entities acquire some individuality. They emerge in such a way that they cannot be reduced to just their parts. Something new happens at the higher level. So here's what science has to tell us. We've learned a few things since Darwin. Evolution happens at many emergent levels that themselves have not always existed but evolved. And here's what has to happen for higher levels of individuality to emerge. One thing is boundaries. We hear a lot about boundaries in pop psychology. Well, boundaries allow us to get something done internally and to be individuals. Also, another thing that has to happen is the emergent individual has to identify itself from the environment or other individuals, perhaps. This is a classic example is the immune system. And the way it does is fairly complex, and there's different kinds of immune systems that have evolved. The third thing that has to happen is there has to be some kind of punishing or withholding of rewards from parts of the emerging individual that exhibit so-called free-riding behavior. We'll talk more about free-riding behavior later, but basically it means that these parts are not contributing as much or incurring less costs than other parts, or that they're optimizing their own fitness instead of the emerging individual fitness. And punishing is a strong term. It just basically means imposing costs or withholding benefits. Could also mean rehabilitation. A fourth thing that needs to happen for emergence of individuality at a higher level is to help the needs of parts be congruent with the needs of the current whole without subsuming the parts. Subsuming means destroying the integrity of the parts. What has to happen is that the parts and the whole co-evolve with each other. Here's a classic example, an old growth forest where the needs of the trees are coordinated with the needs of the forest through fungal networks. The fifth thing that has to happen is to reduce competition, conflict at the lower level. One way to do that is through specialization. We've learned that Darwinian evolution happens at all levels of organization where individuality exists. But this is crucial. Competition at the lower levels usually hurts the higher levels.
contrary to some interpretations of Adam Smith in economics. So here's an example of crew boats, and the rowers, if they were to compete with each other within a boat, would reduce the fitness of the boat. So the boats are competing with each other, but they don't really want to have internal competition, even though it does happen. We have to understand the differences between these levels because each has different needs and appropriate qualities. So what we normally call an individual, a human being, needs freedom, autonomy, and creativity, for example. A family needs love, chemistry, trust, maybe a gift economy. A tribe or village or even an economic company needs these Ostrom principles, which we'll get to shortly, that to help it function optimally, and it needs reciprocity. And so on. A city needs other things: bureaucracy, laws, culture, companies. Nation state also needs other things. So yeah, for example, as far as individual freedom, humans needed more than cells or families or tribes or nations or DNA. a tribe a tribe needs these Ostrom principles more than higher levels of organizations or lower levels of organization. The global economy is not, at this point, an organism or an individual. And the way we can see this is that those criteria or some of those criteria are not happening for the lower levels. Like there's still the global economy is not trying to minimize competition between its parts, the companies, the cities, the nations. Also, free riding is not punished in any way. There's lots of politicians who free ride. There is companies that try to free ride on the environment, on the atmosphere, on the oceans. And also, it seems to subsume or outcompete its parts, destroying the integrity of tribes, villages, intentional communities, and maybe even families. Families are in decline. The unfortunate part about this is that if we want human beings to be happy, they seem to need the kind of connection that they get from villages or tribes or families. They're not psychologically, neurologically replaceable by entities like companies, cities, or nations. So maybe human beings are also going to be subsumed. One of Gandhi's economists in the 1930s by the name of Kumarappa told a story where he was trying to figure out why the Indian villages are declining, and he went to visit an Indian village and he met this man who was complaining about how the young people are all leaving and villages are losing people. And Kumarappa noticed that there was a rug from Liverpool in this man's living room. And he understood then that that's the problem, that instead of exchanging goods and services within the village or within a network of villages, they're buying rugs from Liverpool. And that's what the global economy does. It outcompetes the local economy of villages. Here's a graphic portrayal of how that works. At first, we have these nested levels. Then we have corporations that form, and mediate between the global economy and individuals. And as that happens, tribes lose their connection to cities, families lose their connection to tribes, and finally, even individuals may lose their connection to families. And without these connections, tribes, villages, and families disappear. And without families, tribes, and villages, humans can't thrive. A similar thing happens with our connection to nature. The global economy is outcompeting our connection with nature. As corporations get stronger and we mediate through them, our connection to nature gets weaker. Now, I'm not trying to say the global economy is the devil. There's certain advantages of the global economy, otherwise it wouldn't have evolved. It can promote intergroup tolerance between nations and cultures through communication and travel and certain ideologies. It creates abundance, at least for some, and it allows for many to have time to create art or science. It creates many employment opportunities and free time for some. But it does subsume tribes, villages, and intentional communities unless they are careful to limit interaction with it. Now, one might say socialism is the answer, but it's not. The biologist E.O. Wilson has this quote that Karl Marx was right, socialism works. It's just that he had the wrong species, namely that if he had tried to apply his theories to ants or bees or wasps, he would have had more success. Why is that? I think it's because humans are much more variable in their needs than ants or bees. So at least if you try to create one size or two sizes or even 10 sizes fit all, you're going to subsume, you're going to destroy the integrity of some of the humans. This does not happen with ants. There's not that much variability, so they're not subsumed by fitting in with a whole. Cults and other intentional communities where the needs of the individual humans are subsumed by the need of the collective just don't last. That criterion of not subsuming can't be met unless the higher level makes an effort to do that, to not subsume, to let individuals be. Similarly, some communities try to subsume the needs of the family, and that is not going to work either. The family is necessary for humans. Those communities that do that are not going to evolve individuality and also won't be able to compete. It lowers their fitness. Here's another thing that can happen to intentional communities, but also to other aspiring levels. They need to be able to control free-writing behavior, what I call invading from below. So lower levels of organization that are parts in the current level that's trying to emerge. It can happen in yeast. That's the petri dish on the upper left, that some yeast mutants try to benefit from the colony but do not pay their proportional cost. And if enough yeast do that and are not monitored and punished, the whole colony can collapse. It can happen, the classic example of free riding in biology is cancer, but it can also happen at the gene level. Genes can do something called meiotic drive, where they bias their own representation in progeny cells. This needs to be caught by the organism Otherwise, the organism will be destroyed. So free writing can destroy at the lower levels, can destroy the higher levels. It is just a form of competition at the lower levels. Certain conditions encourage and others discourage free writing. We already looked at how biology evolves punishing mechanisms. But the economist Elinor Ostrom discovered that there are ways to prevent free riding also for human organizations that share a so-called common pool resource. This could be a pasture, this could be a playground, could be a kitchen, it could be land in an intentional community, it could be the whole atmosphere. Before Elinor Ostrom, it was thought that there's only two solutions to the so-called tragedy of the commons problem, a form of free riding where a common such as a pasture is destroyed by everyone trying to get more benefit for themselves without paying a proportional cost. Eventually, the pasture is destroyed. The two solutions were complete privatization, so there is no common pool resource, or socialism, where the government just tells everybody what they can and can't do, tries to regulate them. Ostrom figured out that small groups have a third option, which is to follow these principles that they may not even know they're following them. Elinor Ostrom deduced them from studying many groups that were able to avoid the tragedy of the commons and many groups that were not. The ones that avoided the tragedy of the commons followed these principles. Here they are. We won't necessarily go through them in detail. You can go back and look at them later. The amazing thing is that most of these nature already does in order to form higher levels of individuality that are able to compete and survive. Well, they're also able to cooperate within themselves. So we already talked about boundaries. The congruence just means the first congruence principle is that there is a coherence with the environment. One has to pay attention to the environment that one is in. The second to be is this fairness principle, also avoidance of free riding, that benefits obtained by parts, she calls them users, have to be proportional to costs. So not exactly, but there may be a little bit of tolerance to this ratio, but it's fairly constant. And the third one is not necessarily extendable to all of nature, but has the democratic choice, democratic governance principle that humans will get resentful if they're just told what to do, and they need to be able to participate in decisions affecting their lives. The fourth one is that in order to prevent free riding, you also need to monitor to make sure that principle 2B is followed, that nobody gets too many special privileges and nobody's paying more than their share of the costs, that the cost-benefit ratio is relatively constant. So you need someone to monitor that. Could be from within the group or without the group. The fifth principle is that if people do violate the agreements, mostly about how to share the resources in a fair way without free riding, that there has to be graduated sanctions. You can't just expel people on the first offense, and the degree that they're violating the agreements has to be proportional to the sanctions. Don't want draconian sanctions. The sixth one is about conflict resolution and perhaps reduction. There has to be agreements about that. Conflicts will arise between people, the parts of this emergent individual organism. That's the group or the intentional community or the village or the tribe. People have to agree to these conflict resolution mechanisms. Hopefully, there's ways of reducing conflicts too, such as specialization. There has to be also, the seventh one is there has to be minimal recognition of the rights to organize by any entities that may be higher than the group, the village, the intentional community, not necessarily not necessarily emerging individuality, such as the government, the local government authorities have to recognize the community or the group. And the eighth one is about not being subsumed by the higher levels. The higher levels need to allow the community or the village to run their business to some extent, not to violate their boundaries. Many intentional communities confuse the level of the family with the level of tribe or village or community. And this has two negative effects. One is that individual humans are not getting the support, the intimacy that they need from a family because they're with a bunch of strangers that hasn't formed a family. And the second thing that can go wrong is that at the level of the community, Austrian principles are needed to keep integrity and of that community, to keep that individuality, to keep it from free riding, all these things. And it doesn't need to happen as much at the family level. Austrian principles don't need to happen as much at the family level, but at the community level, at the village level, they do need to happen. So if people are still operating with a family mentality, the community suffers. Free riding happens, all kinds of things can happen. So it's important to not subsume the family with a community and to keep the distinctions between them in mind.
Realize that scale makes a difference for how easy it is to implement Austrian principles. At the level of a international corporation, they're very difficult to uphold. Here's why, because let's say the common pool resource would be the atmosphere or the land and oceans where waste goes for, say, mining companies or companies that need to extract something from the earth. And these Austrian principles are usually violated. User and resource boundaries, it's not always clear what they are for the atmosphere, land and oceans around where the company has a private holding. clear that they can do congruence with local conditions. Usually they use money and threats of violence to get the resources they want without congruence. And the appropriation and provision principle, the fairness principle, doesn't always hold. Shareholders have a higher return on investment than other stakeholders, such as neighbors or everybody else who suffers the consequences, who often have a negative return on investment. They can't do very well with the collective choice arrangements. Stakeholders often have no voice, and it's very hard to monitor people in these international corporations. It's easy to cheat due to the complexity of the system. Another result of having the global economy is that we have ineffective global feedbacks like global warming. We don't have a situation with a much smaller scale, such as a family or a village. If people mess up, they get immediate feedbacks, often to themselves or their neighbors. This is not the case with global feedbacks. Here's a tool for intentional communities that avoids all these problems we saw before: free riding, competition or subsuming from above, and ineffective feedback such as global warming. I call it community-supported community, and here's how it works. You start with as many people as you can get who want to agree to provide each other with goods and services that they need. And in the beginning, not everything will be able to be produced within this community. Some things will have to be imported. That's okay, but the goal is to keep closing the loops, to keep localizing basic needs. And new people are screened for that. Can they provide goods and services that are needed and wanted by the people who are already there? And are they willing to, first and foremost, get their basic needs met from within the community, from producers within the community? If this grows, eventually all basic needs could be produced within the community, and it can go viral if it works. Other communities can do this too. How many people? Probably thousands to provide all basic needs, but it has to start with just a few. What is the common pool resource? Well, it could either be the land, or it could also include the goods and services that are produced. If it's the goods and services as well, then the Austrian principles, especially the fairness one, is going to be built into this arrangement. It will be decided in advance what people are going to produce, and everybody has to agree that it's fair to do the exchange of goods and services the way they decide. This also has the advantage of producing interdependence, minimizing conflict due to specialization, and providing individual, or at least family, freedom to do what people like to do as far as production. There's one other thing that sociologists have noticed that is important to keep in mind for intentional communities, especially liberal communities. Note, I'm not conservative temperamentally. I'm very liberal. I'm very open-minded and open to new experiences, but I'm also humble enough to recognize that conservative communities have figured some things out that we can learn from. Here's a graph that shows that they last longer. I think this is mostly for 19th century communities, but it seems the trend continues even through the 20th and 21st century. One thing they figured out is to respect authority. Now, this is not about random, unearned authority. This is about people getting good at something due to experience and study, or perhaps hard work, or perhaps just innate luck and talent. But whatever it is, it's important that if people have gotten good at something, that they should have more of a voice in that particular area than people who are just starting out and may not be as good at it. Of course, authority can be abused, and that's why a lot of liberal people are suspicious of it, and they should be. But it can also be something that works for the benefit of a community to let people who are good at something serve the community in that capacity. Another thing that conservative communities have figured out is they unify around something sacred, and it's important to have that, whatever it is. And sometimes they do this through what sociologists call high-cost rituals, that something that's hard to fake, that show that you really are invested in the community. And the third thing that sociologists have figured out is important is this sense of loyalty that conservative communities are really good at. First and foremost, having loyalty to people in the community. Perhaps the family comes even before that, but it's important to prioritize people inside this boundary of the community versus the outside. And of course, there's other mechanisms, but these, like having people look at themselves first and doing inner work, trying to figure out what are their motivations, what are their roles in certain conflicts that may occur, instead of blaming others. Liberal communities can do this just as well. In fact, I believe liberal communities can do the other three just as well as conservative communities. They just have to be humble and look at it and do it. So, in summary, I just suggested these things that can be done. The first is localization in order to create interdependence and coherence between people and between people and nature, which Jonathan Haidt showed are essential for happiness. Minimize competition for their attention from levels of organization higher than tribe or village, such as cities, nations, and global economy. Distinguish between family and community. Don't confuse those two. Remember the three so-called conservative or unifying values, which are to become more open to earned authority, agree on the sacred, and feel belonging and loyalty through ritual, cultural activities, and perhaps inner work. In order to avoid free writing of all sorts and being subsumed, follow Ostrom principles. And I suggested a tool called Community Supported Community, or CSC, that incorporates all of these. Thanks for listening. You don't have to like.
But maybe you can help me start a CSC that can go viral and create a real alternative for people. I also want to mention about free writing something I forgot to mention earlier, that free writing can actually be beneficial sometimes. A classic example of that is with multicellular or sexually reproducing organisms, where most of the sperm cells and the egg cells can be considered to be free riders. They're just benefiting, coddled by the rest of the somatic cells of the organism. Most of them don't end up doing anything of benefit. A few of them actually do and end up propagating the next generation. But they can still be considered free riders as a whole. So just a wrench in the simplistic interpretation of punishment of free riders. They can also be valuable. Sometimes we can think of artists or maverick scientists as these people. Okay, thank you again.